Hi, everyone. Welcome to Just One Thing. My name is Conchetta Green, and this is my wonderful guest, Eugenia Gibbons.
Hello.
I'm so glad you're my guest today. And I just have to say this real quick because I didn't get to do it before we went live on air, but Lord Jesus, help. Amen. Okay, so there's that. So today we are talking about anti-racism and the environment. And in the original episode of Just One Thing, I talked about how there's a part that we all have to play in racial justice, right? There's the work that white people need to do. They're waking up to racism and how it impacts all these different structures and just the fact that it does exist. And then there's work that people of color have to do as well. And I believe a lot of that has to do with engagement and ownership and just learning a little bit more about these systems. Today, we have my friend Eugenia Gibbons here. She is a climate, health, justice advocate. And we're just going to talk. And you guys get to watch us talk and learn because I'm learning. So here's the thing. So I grew up in Dorchester. And that's part of the inner city of Boston, Mass. And I always grew up thinking that climate change and the environment and save the whales and all that stuff were luxury pet projects for white people. Okay. I always felt like Black people don't have time to talk about saving the trees. We are out here dying. We got more important things to do. And then I met Eugenia, who is a POC and does this work regarding environmental justice all the time. And so, Eugenia, I just want you to tell us why my opinion has been ill-informed and why it matters.
Well, first of all, thank you, Conchetta, for having me on your show. This is awesome. I'm really honored to be here. I think for those who don't know, you're who I want to be when I grow up. So I'm like really thrilled to be here with you. This is great. You know, your perception of sort of the environmental movement in general is not ill-informed, and I don't think it's really that off base. I think a lot of people traditionally felt disconnected from the environmental movement, and a lot of that has to do with the history of the conservation movement in general, which was very much focused on preserving the wilderness, preserving the natural wild world. And this is going back a couple hundred years. But it was intended to preserve those resources for a particular type of American, right? So largely affluent white America. Think of Teddy Roosevelt. He's kind of like who I think of when I think of the early conservation movement. Okay. So it was really sort of designed, conservation early on was really intended to be a way to kind of preserve these resources for the use and pleasure and enjoyment of upper class white Americans.
Yeah.
So that's not off base. I think the conservation movement had a lot of work to do to try to shed itself of that early perception. Yeah. The environmental movement sort of emerged less about trying to conserve resources for the use and enjoyment of upper class Americans and more about how to be responsible in our use of these finite resources and try to be sustainable in our use of natural resources. And the environmental movement's really about promoting responsible stewardship of our environment, of the natural environment. And so even that is a little bit disconnected from most people's day-to-day lives.
Right.
And over the years, that certainly evolved. And I think we're seeing people in the movement kind of come around because partly, I think, my opinion is partly because climate change touches everybody's life. And so we're seeing the various movements respond to this. But but it makes sense that that's where you would kind of think about it. The environmental justice movement grew out of a response to this disconnect between who has access to resources and who is bearing the brunt of the exploitation of those resources.
Okay.
So the environmental, and because of that, so the environmental movement itself was never really anchored in equity and injustice. The environmental justice movement, in response to, a study in the 80s, which found that Brown and Black communities disproportionately were bearing the brunt of environmental degradation tied to development and also poor siting practices. So in other words, when a power plant was built, it wasn't built in, it was deliberately sited in a low-income community or in a community of color. If there was a petrochemical plant that was built, it was built there for a reason. Trash transfer station, all of these things that are very dirty, very polluting, very energy consumptive. They're cited in those communities for a reason. And so the environmental justice movement grew out of a response to the fact that there was no accountability for how these things were getting cited and how these decisions were being made. And there was no focus on the very real consequences of terrible pollution on shortening the lives of Brown and Black Americans. And so now what we see in the climate movement in particular is the environmental justice piece, and this is the part that I work closely with others who are even more expert than me, is not only about holding folks accountable for the way that communities have been basically hung out to dry while everything else was driven by economic growth and development and all of it and success and wealth and whatever. But it's really about anchoring the revisioning and the visioning of a clean energy future in equity and injustice, so that we are saying, look, we're acknowledging this was done to these communities. And now we're saying you need to prioritize the interests, health, well-being of these same communities when we think about what a clean energy future looks like, what we think about a response to climate change looks like, because we have historically been the ones paying with our health, with our lives, with our communities to get to a good place. And by the way, all the things you were doing to us to get there caused climate change.
But how, okay, so you said that these toxic industries and plants and everything are intentionally set in certain communities, right? Mm-hmm. How does that even happen?
Do you have another hour?
No, but we can rush through this one. Come on.
Well, I mean, part of it has to do with who holds the power, who holds decision-making power, who is making the choices and the decisions about how things happen. In the world of public policy, very few things happen by accident. Everything happens by design. And so I think
because that's what policy is, right?
Yeah, policies are designed to, good policies. I always say good policies can really transform the way, in the energy space, the way we use and make energy, the way we support and strengthen communities, the way we empower people.
Yeah, but policy is what informs law, or does policy become law? Like, who's writing these rules and these ideas, and how is that moving?
People are informing and writing those things. And so to answer your first question, kind of how do things get cited where they got cited? How did that happen? Well, we live in a country, and this is the connection to structural and institutional racism. We live in a country that was designed to lift certain folks up and oppress other people. Mm-hmm. And so those inherently racist practices and beliefs were the underpinning of many historical policies. So when you think of things like discriminatory housing practices or redlining, you think of things like zoning or siting, or where highways are built and whose community is cut through by a highway. It was by design that it was the communities who had the least political clout, who maybe didn't have the most representation at the table when these conversations were happening, that they were not able to, they had to live with the consequences of someone else's decision. And so that's how we got to that place. And my hope is that we are shifting away from that,
Okay.
Today. And
Okay. So political clout. What you mean by that? How do some people have clout enough to say, no, we only want these toxins to be pushed out. We want these smokestacks to be put here. Like, how can anyone look at that kind of written down and say, okay, that's fine. We can keep that going.
Well, so, I mean, it's a complicated relationship.
We're here to learn.
Yeah. No, I think one thing is there's the representation within our state house or within decision-making and lawmaking bodies. So do those really represent the communities that they're supposed to? Do elected officials truly represent the communities that they're coming from? And, in some cases they are. I would argue that certainly, 50 years ago when we were building highways, they were not. Where we still have a long way to go to have a fully representative government, but it's, slightly improved. So at the top, I would say it has to do with who's in elected office.
Okay.
And that's not strictly state house politics. That's local politics, who's on city council, who's on your school committee, who's in the mayor's seat, or, whatever it is, who is at the table, and are they representing your interests? Outside of those formal decision-making bodies, there is opportunity to organize on the ground. And I think that I often say in the work that I do in Massachusetts, we almost have an embarrassment of riches in terms of the phenomenal people who are working hard to mobilize individuals on the ground and who are doing this work at a grassroots level to really organize, because that obviously can apply pressure to the top and shift the dialogue a little bit. But in terms of your first question about, how does this happen?
Yeah.
It has to do with literally who is at the table making the decision. And I have a former mentor who is an environmental justice expert and who, she's in California now, and I just have the utmost respect for her. And she won a lot of battles here in Massachusetts and elsewhere. And she used to always say, I'm sure other people say this too, but if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And I feel like for our communities, that's really, truly the case. If you're not in the room, then your interests are up for grabs.
Okay. And so if we can't be in the room, right? So, we're talking about a lot of people who maybe haven't really been involved in the political process. Like me, they said, I'm not really a political person, but now they're like, okay, I need to kind of, step my game up a little bit. How are we supposed to hold our representatives accountable for these interests? How do we make sure that these toxic, industries don't keep getting planted and concentrated in communities of color?
You participate in some of the organizing that's happening. You you engage with the groups that are on the ground. You contact your local legislators. You contact, you can contact the governor. You can contact the administration. You can contact regulators. I think folks should realize, and this took a long time for me to understand too, but our elected officials work for us. And they are accessible. Their one job is to be accessible and accountable to their people who elected them, to their constituents. And so they're generally very responsive when you contact them. So if you have a concern, you can reach out to your legislator, to your elected official. Certainly at this moment in time, we happen to be in Massachusetts. We're at the very tail end of our legislative session. There are pieces of legislation that are being considered that actually deal with some of the things we're talking about, specifically about environmental justice protections. They need to hear from people that this is a priority, that they have to move now. Not next session, not later. And they're generally very responsive. I think to constituent feedback, I think it's important to beat the drum as loud as possible, because otherwise something else, squeakiest wheel always gets the oil, right? Like somebody else's issue will rise to the top.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you're in Boston, if you're anywhere in Massachusetts, there are a number of groups that are doing really phenomenal work. But if you're in the greater Boston area in particular, you can reach out to some excellent folks at places like Green Roots in Chelsea, Neighbor to Neighbor, Alternatives for Community Environment, or ACE, which is in Nubian Square. These are groups who, yes, formerly Dudley Square, but Square. These are groups who for a long time have really been leading the fight on environmental justice in the greater Boston area and throughout Massachusetts. And they're the ones who are really running point right now with some great electeds who have sponsored environmental justice legislation. You know, this isn't the only fight they're waging, but they're really excellent resources and important groups that are worth supporting, and also worth connecting with if you want to get involved very locally.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about you.
Sure.
So you're a Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
You work in this space. And how did you get there? Because I love your story. I love what you shared with me about your mom and how that kind of opened your eyes to some things. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I am originally from Rhode Island, and I grew up, I'm an ocean child. I'm a water baby. I grew up loving the ocean and always had an appreciation for that as the natural resource that was important to my life. I also grew up, there is a Navy base in Newport. And so I also grew up very cognizant of the different pollution that came, not strictly from the Navy base, but, you know, came from places, and the way that the Narragansett Bay was very polluted.
Okay.
And so I always, you know, as a child, I always kind of understood what that looked like, and really kind of that it meant, you know, if something gets really dirty, you cannot use it. And so then as I got older, I never thought of myself as an environmentalist. I still don't even really think of myself as an environmentalist. I grew up in a family where, my mother, for example, was a social worker, and she worked with folks with severe disabilities, developmental disabilities, and physical as well. But she happened to work in an area that was low income, predominantly Black, in a historic part of the city that was unsafe. The housing was unsafe.
Yeah.
And there were, you know, some things were, you know, kids were exposed to high concentrations of lead. You know, it's just her experience of working with her caseload, her people, informed my perception of the importance of having access to safe housing, you know, breathable air, drinkable water, and you know, just access to opportunities that come with that, because many of the health issues that some of her clients were facing were the result of exposure to pollution or exposure to toxic air, and so on and so forth. And so I didn't know at the time that was, you know, going to lead me down this path of environmental work. But because of that experience, I always understood the direct connection between where you live and how that could rightly or wrongly determine where you're able to go in life. And when I became an adult, I just, you know, I did some work with utilities, and I was working in power plants on, you know, environmental projects at power plants, coal-fired power plants. And, you know, the work was interesting, but what was really fascinating to me was the surrounding communities that were hosting these massive structures and had been home to these power plants for multiple generations. And I was interested in sort of, you could see on the ground how the community had sort of over time just kind of crumbled around these aging power plants. and, all of the health impacts and environmental impacts that the facilities were having on the neighboring communities. But I was also really interested in sort of the decisions that were being made at a much higher level around why investments needed to be made at that moment in cleaning up the pollution coming out of the stacks from those plants. And so I found myself wanting to be at the table of making good policy, and and then seeing it get implemented. And so I went back to school and I got my master's in urban environmental policy and planning from Tufts University right here in Medford, and I loved it. I loved it, and it was sort of the convergence of all of my interests, and that was really the first time that I was able to put a name on what I had always grown up seeing, which was, this is what environmental justice is. This is what we call it, and this is how we empower each other to change it. And so that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing.
All right, so tell me this. We talked kind of broad, right? We gave the general frame of, okay, racism is connected to environmental justice. Let's make it real.
Yeah.
Tell me how issues like Flint, Michigan can happen. The water crisis, right? You and I talked before about how it's a perfect example of how vulnerable communities still live, and this is still going. The water is still contaminated. So talk to us about that. How does that happen?
That happens when Flint is a hard one because it's still unsafe.
Right.
Like the water is still not drinkable, and it's 2020. It happens because because people who were in positions of power and who were able to make decisions about how resources would get directed. In the case of Flint, it had to do with the water source that Flint had access to for many years, and an unwillingness to invest in upgrading the infrastructure by decision makers, and to take the cheap route without consideration for what the consequences would be. And then we ended up with poisoned water and an uptick in Legionnaire's disease as a result. And so that happened because it was framed as an opportunity to save money, I guess. I'm not an expert on Flint, but in all of my reading,
in general.
Yeah, in general, and this is not unusual, right? At least in Flint, like, it was framed as, well, this is, Flint, it's going to be too expensive to replace the pipes. This is a safer alternative. Trust us. We're going to do it this way. Well, it wasn't a safer alternative. I think often what happens is with the siting of toxic facilities, you hear arguments like, this is going to bring jobs to the community. This is going to enhance your tax base. This is, you might have a facility that says, oh, we're going to donate this amount of money to the school. You need money with the schools, in the schools. Right. So it's sort of packaging, a shiny new project in things that seem like great resources for a place that maybe really does need those things. But it's really taking the choice away from the community. That's at the end of the day, like, the connection between environmentalism and racism, really, they're all the same thing. It comes down to who holds the power, who's making decisions, whose interests are those decisions being made in. How do we, and I think, and you and I talked about this, I mean, I think in order to restore power to the community, it requires creation of new relationships, a restoration of trust, and the introduction of real transparency in decision making and in development or whatever it is going forward. And if we fail, and that's the role of individuals, that's the role of communities, that's the role of organizers. That's why we are here. That's why we exist. It's my community, and this is what I want to see done. And we have strength in numbers. So let's come together and push. Is it going to be easy? No. Is it going to happen overnight? No. I mean, some things that my colleagues and I have been arguing for in terms of, equitable access to energy efficiency have been happening for a decade. We're a little bit closer to getting it, but it's been a decade that we've been saying the same thing. So, but really it's about recognizing your own power as a citizen and as a resident of your community, and recognizing your voice and inserting it and asserting it in
even
a way
if you're not like super well versed on, what needs to happen.
Nope. Because you know what, Conchetta, that's where I come in, or that's where my colleagues come in. It's our job. And I have to say, actually, I know a lot more people who are, your average citizen who maybe started the fight saying, like you did, like, this isn't really my thing, I'm not super well versed, who are way more expert on some of the technical stuff than I ever will be, because they just went right into it. You don't have to be an expert. The same way I said, like, your electeds are more accessible than you realize. This fight, you can engage in it at any level. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to you don't have to think that climate change is your number one priority. But you might think that, I've now watched my neighbor bring their 5-year-old to the ER 6 times this year because of an asthma attack. That's air pollution that's causing it. Air pollution is also causing climate change. Now you're in the conversation around climate change, and your health. So you just have to find the lever that you can pull, or find the place where you feel comfortable, and you engage in the way that you're comfortable. And it doesn't mean, I know last time you were talking about, door knocking and where it's a little, you don't have to be out in front. It could, maybe you host a meeting, maybe you write a letter, maybe you just make a phone call to your elected, or you write an email to your city council or something. Maybe you just have a conversation with a friend. Maybe you're watching this show and you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. Find a way to plug in and recognize that we all have a role to play, and it can be any role you want it to be, but it's important that your voice is heard, because it's about your community, where you live, and what you want to see. And in my case, it's about what I want to see our state do to really, truly be a leader on equity and justice.
Can you tell me, so when we talked before, you also told me about there being like some really high pollution points in the city of Boston. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there was we were talking specifically about transportation and exposure to particulate matter from tailpipe emissions. So the Union of Concerned Scientists issued a study earlier this year which looked at measures of particulate matter in different points around the city, and actually along the East Coast.
Hold on. Particulate matter being?
The pollution that's coming out of your tailpipe. So the stuff that you breathe in, you might not, so there's stuff, the pollution you breathe in, the soot that you see kind of coming out of everywhere. Ultra fine particulate matter you don't even see.
Okay.
But that's the really, really nasty stuff. That's the stuff that embeds itself in your lungs, that enters your bloodstream, that is really toxic, and you're not seeing it at all. But so pollution coming from tailpipes contributes to high rates of respiratory illness and circulatory illness. It also contributes to emissions from tailpipes also contribute to climate change. So this study looked at who is most exposed to this pollution from cars. And in Boston, they were able to pinpoint there are particular neighborhoods in Boston where the exposure is the highest.
Okay.
And places like China, you could almost, I wouldn't even have to tell you, you could just think about where are the places where the most number of highways and roads are intersecting.
Okay.
But Chinatown was one of them. I don't have it in front of me. I believe, actually, I'll get you the report and you can post it. There's a point either in Roxbury or Dorchester, I forget exactly where it is, that it's another one.
In Roxbury as well, yep.
Yep.
And so as these points are sort of converging and the pollution is super high, people are being impacted. If you add to that now the layer of COVID-19, how are we having this conversation now? How does the conversation sort of shift?
So one is we have reports. There's a report recently out of Harvard that pointed to the connection between COVID and high exposure to pollution, air pollution, so poor air quality. Mm-hmm. The Attorney General's office also did another study that looked at, or just issued a report recently looking at COVID, but also pointing to the communities that were most susceptible to the virus, and also who has been most impacted by the virus. It's Chelsea, Lowell, Lynn, some gateway communities, gateway cities in Massachusetts. There are some low-income communities of color, communities that have, even before COVID, had high rates of exposure to pollution, like we were talking about. And so now we're seeing that there is an inextricable link between, climate and health, and air pollution and health, which we always kind of knew, but these things are really kind of all coming together at once. Yes. And COVID, I mean, in my opinion, I feel like COVID, I said this recently when I was testifying at a hearing, like COVID has really laid bare all of the structural inequities that allowed us to burden certain communities with our development and our consumption of fossil fuel, burning and all of these things. And it has, because of that, it has made clear that if we do not act to address the vulnerability that we've caused, then the very same communities that have suffered the worst from the virus are going to be most exposed and most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Okay. And we already knew this. I mean, study after study says, our most vulnerable communities are the ones who are going to be on the front lines of climate change. Mm-hmm. Now we can really pinpoint, like, we told you. We told you so.
Like, it's really clear now, right? It's undeniable that there's a connection. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that there's a bill right now in Massachusetts. I don't know what the terminology is. You say like it's on the floor, or it's on the table, that Rep. Liz Miranda has really also been helping to support. Yes. So a couple of things. Okay. There are 3 environmental justice bills that have been filed this session that the House bill is currently in, I believe it's in House Ways and Means, which basically they need to hear phone calls saying we support this bill, so please move it to the floor for a vote. We want to see that bill pass. Or, you don't have to ask them to move it to the floor for a vote. Just indicate that you really support the environmental justice legislation and you want to see it prioritized this session. Okay. And so to your point about Rep. Miranda, I think Rep. Miranda is an excellent example of what I said earlier, which is when you have people in elected office who understand who they are speaking for, who elected them, and whose interests they represent when they get into the state house, then you have a conversation. You see the conversation shift. I think she's an excellent example of this. I mean, there are many others in the state house as well. Yes. But she, to me, is one of the folks who really exemplifies, like the interests of her community are always what guide her when she's thinking about what to advocate for. And she certainly recognizes the importance of environmental justice protections, very similar to Rep. Dubois, who's also one of the, and Senator Sal DiDomenico, who's another, they're both other sponsors on these bills, and Rep. Madaro. It's their communities that are living with the burden of, pollution. So they get it and they're advocating for it. So it's reflected in this bill. I think at this moment, so Massachusetts has 2-year legislative cycles. Okay. We're at the end
of the second year. The session ends formally on July 31st. Understandably, legislators are struggling right now with, they're not struggling, they're grappling with figuring out the budget for the state, with responding to COVID, with moving, there are a lot of heavy issues that they're thinking about. Climate legislation and environmental justice legislation are up there too. And in my mind, it's really important for folks to make sure that legislators understand how important it is to act on both climate and environmental justice. I always say you can't address one without addressing the other. And at this moment in time, given everything that's happening in our country and, in our world, but even here in our states, it's almost unconscionable not to move forward on a bill that's designed to introduce environmental justice protections, because as we just talked about with COVID, we know who is vulnerable and they are currently not protected.
Right.
So, yeah.
So I have to say, so our first episode, we talked about getting involved in the political process and kind of letting go of the fears surrounding that. And then as we talk about this, I feel the same thing. Like, it's all this engagement now that's really being demanded by this place that we live in. One thing that I love that you said is that the world belongs to all of us, and we have to take ownership. And as I thought about that, as I've been thinking about that, I think, or I wonder if sometimes if that can be a difficult concept for a lot of African Americans to grasp, because for so long we were owned, right?
Yeah.
And there are patterns, that come down generation to generation. We're not that far from slavery. We're not that far from Jim Crow, right? So, sorry, that's my environmentally safe.
Very good. You're metal straw. I love it.
Thank you. But like, we're used to being owned. Okay. So there's patterns here. If we're talking about systemic things, and I think there can be a lot of fear about taking ownership and stepping up to say, no, I have a right to this. As a citizen, I do have a right to speak up. I don't have to wait for things to just hit me and to be so reactive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense. And I think I can see how it can be a lot to ask people who are used to being in uncomfortable situations to get further out of their comfort zone and feel even more uncomfortable in the push for a response to climate change. However, I think there are a couple of things there. I think one is their public polling actually shows that more African Americans and Latinx Americans recognize climate change is happening, think it should be a priority, and support bold action on climate change than their white counterparts. So it's actually not entirely true that people of color aren't thinking about climate change. More of them are thinking about climate change. More registered voters are thinking about climate change than their white counterparts. And more registered voters of color want it to be prioritized than their counterparts. Does it rise to the number one issue for most voters? No, but it's up there. And there's some, thinking that part of that is because of all of the things that we just spoke about, right? Where it's communities of color are living daily with the impact of bad siting, bad housing policy, bad transportation policy, poor regulation of polluting facilities, all of these things. And so it is their everyday life. They're living it every day. And also, I think more and more people are really mobilizing to change it. So I come from a place where, I was always so used to being the only person of color, the only woman of color in a room. often the youngest person in the room in these conversations about policy. And what I'm seeing more and more is that there's a shift happening. And what I really get super excited about is just nationally, there are some phenomenal voices of people of color who are pushing on climate change. They're scientists. They are epidemiologists. They are, they are the voices who are doing the research, who are doing the digging. And because it's their voice, and because they're Black and brown people, they are dealing with this duality that we're talking about, right? You can do both climate and think about your community and your race. And so I get excited about that. I follow everybody on Twitter because I'm just like, yes, you can. It's going to be so much harder to try to compartmentalize all of these issues. You cannot say, you know what, we're going to deal with COVID today, and then we're going to deal with racism next week, and then we'll get back to environmental policy. No, they're all part of the same thing. Like, you got to do it all at once. You got to tackle racism and systemic racism, and what you do there needs to be reflected in the policies you come up with that address public health and safety, and that address environmental health and access to transportation and all of them. You can't disentangle them anymore.
Yeah. When we first talked about some of this, I remember being on the phone with you saying, I think this might be how some of my white sisters and brothers feel when they find out that, oh my gosh, like racism is legit and it impacts everything that we do. And the more I hear you talk, I feel like, okay, so pollution and the environment and all these things that we're doing, they affect everything that we do, right? They're systemic. They do involve race. And how things are done. And as you're talking, I was remembering Ayanna Pressley. I heard her recently say, the people closest to the pain should always be the ones closest to the power, right? Talk about us representing interests, not just showing up on voting day, going eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and yay, I got my sticker. It really is, who are we putting in there? And then how are we staying engaged with them once they get elected, right?
Yeah.
Like emailing them. Are you supporting this? Like I just emailed one of my reps this week about a bill, and I said, I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but I heard of this. It's really important to me. Can you tell me, do you plan on supporting this? And sure enough, like you said, she responded right back and said, oh, absolutely. I know what that is.
Excellent.
I'm like, oh, okay. But that was scary. That was scary for me. Like I'm not used to engaging on that level. And I think there are a lot of people who are kind of similar to that. By the way, this is live and I did figure out the comments. So if you guys have questions for Eugenia, feel free to type them into the comments. I should see them. Respond like as they come up. So what else do I have here? Hold on, because there's a couple of things I want to make sure that we get to before our time is up. Okay, so how do we make sure that more people have access to the solutions? Like how do we combat climate change in just normal, maybe some small things that we can do?
Sure. I mean, it's easy to get overwhelmed when you think like, oh man, climate, what can I do to stop it? Yeah. But I think, individual choices matter because they matter in your home, but also you might be influencing other folks around you. That might be the way that you're engaging in the decision-making, right? Yes. So the easiest thing, and the thing I always tell folks to take advantage of first and foremost, is energy efficiency, our energy efficiency programs in Massachusetts.
Okay.
We're actually, so we have a nation-leading energy efficiency program. It's administered by the utilities, and we all pay into the program when we pay our electricity bill or our heating bill. And so take advantage of it. We all do. Everybody, if you have your utility services provided by Eversource or National Grid, or any of the investor-owned utilities across the state, gas or electric, you're paying a tiny amount on your bill, fractions of a penny.
All those numbers that I never pay attention to.
Yeah, they go into support things like renewable energy investment and also energy efficiency. Okay. So take advantage of the efficiency programs. It's a little bit, there are two different programs. There's the residential program for folks who live in 1 to 4 unit homes, and then there's a residential program for folks who live in multi-unit housing, so if it's more than 4 units. But anyway, call Mass Save and see what you can do to just reduce your electricity or your gas consumption. Because
so for owners and renters?
For owners and renters, so I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we advocate for pretty staunchly and have done so for the last decade is trying to make it easier for renters to access the program.
Okay.
At the moment, you do need to work with your landlord to to move forward with what are referred to as major measures, but you can still, as a renter, call the utility and they'll do a virtual, I believe they're doing like online assessments right now, and you'll get some quick, what are referred to as instant savings measures. Okay. And then work with your landlord to try to get them to do more, like insulation of the home. The reason why that matters is because it matters to your bottom line, right? You want to save money. So you will, if you're more efficient in your use of energy, you'll save money. But the other thing is, burning fossil fuels causes climate change. So the more we can,
fossil
fuels, dirty, polluting things like gas, coal, oil. When we're burning those types of fuels that are extracted from the earth, that is what causes the pollution from burning fossil fuels is what causes climate change. Right, there's also pollution associated with the extraction of those resources. But the main thing is if you burn fossil fuel, that's what causes climate change. Everything we do in some form or fashion comes back to a fossil fuel. And so we're trying to get out of it. You're supposed to live more efficiently. So if you use less, you're burning less.
Okay.
If you happen to be in a place where you can, honestly, right now in COVID, we're all kind of walking everywhere. No one's going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But, there are other things that you can do to, reduce your carbon footprint. The goal is to reduce your carbon footprint.
Okay.
I am going to give a little plug for my former organization where I used to work, Green Energy Consumers Alliance, because they have a voluntary green power program, which is basically a big way of saying you can also make your electricity supply completely renewable. So wind powered. If you happen to live in Melrose like we do, or a couple of other cities around the Commonwealth, those cities have actually worked to create an opportunity to green up your electricity through something called aggregation. So in Melrose, you're already probably participating in Melrose's aggregation program. You should opt up to 100%. So you get 100% renewable energy.
Does it cost anything else to do that? Like, is there a cost?
There's a calculator on the aggregation website, and it'll tell you how much more, if anything, you'll have to pay to have 100% renewable power. But it's generally a nominal increase.
Okay.
The purpose of the aggregation is that the city negotiated a lower price for our electricity supply.
Okay.
And within that electricity supply, we have more like renewable energy content. So we're already saving money compared to or relative to, basic service from the utility. So you can opt up if you're able to. So that's all a long way, Conchetta, of saying things you can do in your home are take little steps to reduce your carbon footprint. And the easiest ones to do right now, the lowest hanging fruit, are energy efficiency and the electricity content that the content of your electricity supply.
All right. And now talk about, I know you said also something that we can do is to kind of pay attention to policies. You said how good policy can be transformational.
Yeah. They can be.
I mean, obviously, right? So if we have these policies that can be so damaging, you know, how do we make sure that we get policies that kind of undo some of that or kind of shift the direction?
Yep. You right now in this moment, you contact your local legislators and you indicate that, as I said, that you would like to see climate and environmental justice policy move before the end of the year.
Okay.
And then stay engaged, because there's a lot of planning happening at the state level. There's a lot that's moving. The legislative session ends, but we haven't solved climate change. We haven't solved, we haven't come up with a way to totally dismantle racism. So I would say if you're able to plug into some of the groups that I mentioned earlier, just follow get their newsletter or follow their blogs, or just, make sure that you're in a position to receive the information that they're putting out there, because there might be something that comes up at one point that it piques your interest. And it doesn't even have to be like a call to action. It could just be, maybe you hear a new speaker, or maybe you find out about a new report that you want to read. And that might be the way that you kind of get into this space and into this movement. So plug into your local organizations and who are doing this work and who are leading, because also they're leading at the state level too, and get engaged that way.
Now, tell me something. This is just kind of a rando question for you, but I heard from someone as we were preparing for today. One of my friends reached out and said that there has been proven a connection between violence and heat waves. Have you heard anything about that?
I have not. I've heard this, but I haven't seen the actual analysis that definitively connects it. However, I grew up in St. Louis, and I used to always hear that like the summer months are coming and we're going to see things happening. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know. What I do know is we are about to experience one of the hottest summers of record, and we are going to.
How do you know this?
They've been the scientists and folks have been predicting this for a few months now, that we're about to have one of the hottest summers with, many 90-degree plus days. And those hot days and the extreme heat is, first of all, extreme heat is actually very dangerous for public health reasons, but the extreme heat and COVID are about to converge. So that is going to be interesting. I don't know that we're necessarily prepared for the extreme heat, let alone the two coming together. And in densely developed, densely populated urban centers, you definitely do have the heat island effect, which, it's hotter. There's less green space. There is less space for it's just hotter.
Wait. So hold on. So you're saying, so I'm just kind of gathering from what you're talking, a little bit of context clues here. You can get a heat island if you have a densely populated area, right? And not enough trees and sort of, like you said, green space, grass, just kind of open spaces to circulate the flow of air.
The air, think about the difference you experience in temperature if you're standing in a park versus standing on a blacktop.
Oh my God, yes.
So the heat is concentrated and trapped in, sorry, I have a little person trying to get my attention.
Business. Listen, we are on quarantine. We're playing Xbox. I was like, please, somebody take her, because
they kind of tiptoed in and were like, mommy. So sorry, I got distracted for a moment.
That's okay. But you were saying the difference between standing on a blacktop.
So the heat island effect is the heat gets trapped in an area, in an urban area, in an urban center. And when you're having extreme weather events, extreme heat, it's it's uncomfortable, it's hot,
Right.
you have a greater concern for the impacts of extreme heat on vulnerable folks if they're in an area where it's going to be even hotter.
Yep.
And also what happens is it doesn't necessarily get cooler at night. So there's very little relief from the heat.
Wow.
And when I say extreme heat is dangerous to public health, exposure to extreme heat can also lead to heat stroke. It can lead to dehydration. And in urban areas where perhaps, historically we've had access to public pools or sprinkler parks, or in very bad heat waves, maybe you've had access to public cooling centers. Now that we're in a situation where we also have COVID happening, it's going to be interesting to see how communities and how municipalities deal with or respond to extreme heat in those instances.
Wow.
Because there are going to be limitations.
Yeah, we've never had COVID-19 before in the summer. So we don't know. So you're saying we don't really know what it's going to look like, right? What the fallout might be on a health.
Right. Yeah. I can't speak to the uptick in violence, but I can say that there's definitely a health impact.
Yes.
Of very extreme weather, especially extreme heat, and we will see it.
So I'm really grateful that you said that, because again, growing up in the city, I grew up in Dorchester, and people would have gardens in the backyard. Sometimes there'd be community gardens, and again, I just thought it was crunchy granola, folks.
They were ahead of the curve. They were ahead of the curve.
Ahead of the curve, and still are. So I would say to anyone who's watching, also make sure you support your local community gardens and green spaces. If you hear of someone fighting to make sure you have more park space, support them, because it does make a difference. I had no idea. And thank you again for talking to us about policy. Again, the great Ayanna Pressley says, policy is her love language. It's how you speak to the people that you love. And I think when you have these, policies that create disparities, it says a lot, right? About who's being cared for, who's not being cared for. So we do have your information up, your contact information of people. If you want to stay in touch with Eugenia, make sure you
read on Twitter.
Hit her up on Twitter. She will answer your questions. Eugenia is amazing. She always is like right at the head of everything. Like, she knows what's going on with the environment. And I think it's so cool just to see another woman of color in this space, because it's new to me. And to watch you speak and lobby and do all these things that seem so out of the scope of, the average person's life. It's really amazing. So I want to say thank you on behalf of the environment.
Well, thank you, Conchetta. This was so fun. I realized I gabbed and gabbed, but I gabbed because I really believe that, like you said, the environment, all of this belongs to all of us. And I just want to see more people who look like you and me at the table and having this conversation, because policy is also my love language, and good policy can lead to really great things. And we can only do it together. So it's great. So thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it today. If you didn't get a chance to ask your questions now, you can put them in the chat, and Eugenia and I will keep an eye. We'll answer any questions that you might have. But thank you again, Eugenia. I hope you have a good dinner with the kiddies. I will. Hamilton on Disney Plus tonight. There's a party at 7. It's like a nationwide thing, so we're gonna watch that.
Yes, I will be right there with you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.